Lawrence Grandpre, Director of Research, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle.
So currently in Annapolis, there's two proposals to fix a issue with the casino funding not actually increasing and giving additional money to public schools as was promised when it was passed. There's a proposal by Maggie McIntosh that would phase that in over 4 years and to be part of a ballot measure. And then Mary Washington has a proposal that would be just a bill passed this year, and it would put that money, like $500 million in starting next year. What are your thoughts about these two proposals?
Well, I think part of the concern might be limiting it to an ad hoc solution when you need a structural change. So to the extent that some folks may be wary about just saying we're going to toss all the casino money in there as soon as possible, it might be because the funding formula for Baltimore City public schools is pretty complex and deals with court cases and questions of enforcement. So I think you're looking at a more structural solution that might be needed, because simply putting more money into the school system doesn't guarantee superior results. It's a question of, is there accountability for the money? Where is it going towards? And do we have a sustainable long-term funding source that isn't just dependent on casinos or the whims of the governor, but can you actually create an environment where there's some predictability in the funding and the funding begins to match the actual need?
The governor and outlets like Project Baltimore, they argue that the schools aren't underfunded, that it's just an issue of accountability. How do you respond to that?
I think it's complicated. I think some of the numbers that folks use, you can go into the weeds and have differing opinions. So I know you look at the amount of money Baltimore City gets from the state. Some people point out that Baltimore City isn't able to supplement that money with local tax revenue. So while they may be getting a lot of money from the state, they have so little money coming in from the city. The actual money getting to the kids actually isn't this bonanza that the Republicans talk about. I mean, we've been pretty consistent that you need to have a vision of accountability, but to the community in terms of actually producing a framework for educational results that the community finds sufficient, which may include curriculum, may include incorporating local community-based organizations into schools, may include diversity of programming. And that typically isn't talked about in the funding debates. They talk a lot about iPads and air conditioning, and those things are good. But when you're looking at results in a way that actually meets what the community is talking about, the actual parents and the majority, minority, 80-90% of people in Baltimore City public schools are African American, their conversation is a bit different than what the advocates and the politicians are talking about, and I think that that needs to be a central part of the conversation.
And finally, the Kirwan Commission is likely to make suggestions around education funding, and they've already said that they're really looking at, considering poverty and spending more money for high poverty areas, whether it's in Baltimore or other parts of the state. Do you think that this is Kirwan's going to lead to an appropriate fix to help address some of the underfunding that's occurs in Maryland schools?
I think you have to look at the result, but also the process. The result of Kirwan is probably going to be more money for traditionally impoverished school districts, which is hard to argue against. I think the process of Kirwan is really the problem. You have a board that's appointed without community accountability, largely representative of white men and folks with a more technocratic vision of school reform that kind of fits in with a lot of more traditional nonprofits are talking about getting funding for the existing after-school programs, really solidifying the status quo, beefing up the status quo. That is not what parents want, and it's not something that many folks who are benefiting from the status quo like to talk about. And so there needs to be a fine line between any critique of the status quo being seen as capitulating to a Republican governor or Fox News. There's plenty of space to critique the status quo and say that Kirwan is just a means to an end. The means is the money, but the end needs to be comprehensive, community accountable education reform. And I think that in the conversation around the means and getting to the Kirwan formula, the actual process of not including community is producing an end result that may just solidify the status quo. And I don't think the status quo is underfunded. I think it's fundamentally broken. I think it's fundamentally off track. I think most parents would agree with that. And we need to see the funding as a means to not solidification of the existing end, but a new end, a new path for education, which I think means we're going to have to shift the conversation.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We'll keep following the story at therealnews.com and link to our additional coverage of Maryland's public education system in the comments below.
This is Jessel Noor.